My boss tried to frame me. It backfired spectacularly. The first words out of his mouth were, "Nobody's going to believe a whistleblower who just got caught with company data on his personal drive." And he smiled like he'd just closed the case on me for good. That smile was the last of my innocence. I worked at Halcyon Capital for 8 years. I wasn't the partner with the corner office. I was a middle-level analyst who cared more about doing things right than playing politics. For most of those 8 years, I kept my head down, did the grunt work nobody else wanted, and quietly built a reputation with the clients who mattered. Trust, punctuality, accuracy. Then one promotion cycle, the kind where people get a fancy lunch and a title bump. My boss, Daniel, walked into the room, announced the raise and promotion I'd been promised for months, and handed it to his nephew. "No hard feelings," he said to me afterward, as if nepotism were a kind compliment. Then he began the campaign to erase me. It started with small things. My name left off a client email, credit for an analysis I'd done poured onto his decks, unexplained errors, in a report I'd authored that he then fixed and attributed to careless junior staff. I corrected him quietly twice. The second time he called me into his office and told me the same smile I started with. "You need to stop making waves, or we can make waves for you." I didn't know what he meant until the Friday before the annual compliance audit. I found an unfamiliar external drive on my desk. It had my password on a sticky note. Never do that, I know, and inside, a folder of files, spreadsheets, emails, some of which were copies of our proprietary models that we're only supposed to keep on the secure server. The compliance group would flag that as data exfiltration in a heartbeat. If they flagged it, I'd be fired. If I were fired for leaking, the industry rumor mill would turn that into unreliable, and I'd never work in finance again. I thought my best option was to run. I took the drive home, turned on the laptop, and read. Nothing about me. The files on the drive were a map, spreadsheets with hidden columns, annotations, and invoices that didn't add up. Someone had been siphoning fees through a phantom vendor and paying off side contracts. The more I dug, the clearer it was. Daniel was skimming. Small amounts, cleverly redistributed so they looked like administrative overhead. He'd been doing it for years. When I confronted him the next Monday, he laughed. "You don't know what you're looking at," he said. "Leave the numbers to the grown-ups." I told HR next, naive, trusting the process. HR filed the complaint and then promptly told me there'd be an investigation. A week later, a compliance officer called me in and asked if I had any unauthorized files on personal devices. They had retrieved the exfiltration logs from last month. Someone had copied the firm's valuation toolkit off the server and onto an external drive. The clock started ticking on me, not him. By sundown, I was suspended pending investigation. The rumor at the office was merciless. Within hours, people used words like security breach and rogue employee. Daniel's smile widened. "See," he murmured when I crossed his path. "Nobody believes you." That was the injustice, the knife to my career that also sliced my reputation. I was angry in the way grief looks at first. Stunned, raw, then furious. The first impulse is to scream, to storm an office, to destroy the person who hurts you. I remembered the sticky note on the drive, his smugness, the files that pointed at his fraud. But fury alone isn't strategy. Revenge needs planning, and vindication needs proof. I decided I would not only clear my name, I would make sure Daniel couldn't ever ruin someone the way he'd tried to ruin me. I had 3 truths to work with. 1, the files on that drive were real. They were his trail. 2, the company's compliance and audit processes would, if used right, bury him. 3, I still had allies, clients, and colleagues who trusted my work. Step 1, buy time. The suspension bought me a week of being off the clock, but not off the books. I used it to build a discreet, legal audit trail of my own. I started with the obvious, call my trusted clients, and quietly ask for copies of the email threads where I'd sent deliverables. I asked for timestamps and confirmations. A few were skeptical at first, but one of the largest clients, a private real estate fund I'd worked with for years, replied instantly with a folder labeled Project Atlas, all correspondence. It included the draft analyses I had sent with my name in the metadata. We're a profession built on timestamps. Those metadata can be small but critical witnesses. Step 2, secure independent witnesses. I emailed 2 of my closest colleagues who'd seen Daniel rewrite decks to his name. They were scared, people fear being associated with someone accused of embezzlement. But when I walked them through what I'd found in a calm, fact-based way, one agreed to sit with me, and a lawyer more on that. and the other offered to forward an email he'd saved where Daniel took credit for a client save that had been my work. They wanted confidentiality but were willing to be witnesses. Step 3. Get legal counsel. I knew my company had a compliance hotline, but I also knew how easily those calls get lost in HR's desire for quiet resolutions. I called a boutique employment lawyer who specialized in corporate whistleblower cases. He listened, then told me bluntly, "You can either play this by guessing, or you can force the investigation into public view where the company can't quietly bury it. We'll need hard evidence and to move fast, and you can't fabricate anything." He arranged for a preservation letter to be sent to Halcyon's general counsel, a formal legal request that certain documents be preserved because they may become evidence. That stopped some of the company's ability to scrub server logs or alter anything. Legal process had a way of stamping time. Once invoked, it slowed even the nimblest of destroyers. Step 4. Use public record and regulation. Halcyon had clients that were registered funds, and some transactions were reportable. My lawyer and I drafted a carefully worded submission to the regulator, not an accusatory, emotional complaint, but a series of questions and attached documents that suggested irregularities in payments and vendor relationships. Regulators are slow, but they take documents seriously, and a regulator opening a file on Halcyon was an ember that might ignite an internal audit fire. Step 5. Control the narrative. The hardest part was reputation. Even if I had proof, a smear campaign could sour how people heard it. I contacted an investigative journalist I trusted, someone who'd written fair but punchy pieces on finance malfeasance. I didn't leak wild claims. I offered a documented trail and an on-the-record interview contingent on the facts aligning. The journalist's interest was piqued. "If you have documents showing phantom vendors and internal emails where he directs payments, I'll look." He wanted verifiable data, and I had verifiable data. This is where patience and method paid off. I could have run in shouting, but Daniel's power came from the quickness with which he could shape perception. I needed to move slower than fear, faster than cover-ups. Over the next 3 weeks, I compiled an exhibit, copies of the phantom vendor invoices, matching bank routing numbers that tied back to shell accounts, email threads where Daniel assigned administrative fees to that vendor, and the spreadsheets he'd kept on the drive with the hidden formula columns he'd used to redirect percentages. I also had back-and-forth emails that showed Daniel pushing junior analysts to adjust the client invoices to balance the books. I wanted this incontrovertible, so I had everything authenticated. Client threads with metadata, a sworn affidavit from the colleague who'd saved the deck, and the preservation letter. My lawyer added an affidavit of chain of custody for the files, not because I planned to prosecute criminally, but because a legal filing with authenticated documents gives you a seat at the table. And then the step I dreaded but knew I needed. Go public, not shouting on social media, but to someone who could break the story with facts. We called the journalist. He came in with 2 other reporters. We sat in a shabby coffee shop near my apartment and opened the folder. He asked questions that stripped emotion from the narrative and focused on the math and the dates. He was precise, which is what this type of story needs. He said he'd take it to his editor. 2 days later, the article ran, "Allegations of financial misconduct at mid-tier investment firm." It was careful and factual. Phantom vendor invoices, internal emails suggesting manipulation of client billing, and allegations that a Middleville analyst had been suspended after discovering anomalies. It quoted none of my accusations as facts. Instead, it laid out the documents and asked Halcyon for comment. The board responded with anodyne words about a pending internal review. What followed was the part I'd hoped for and feared in equal measure: denial and scramble. Daniel called a meeting and accused me of orchestrating a smear. HR presented a narrative about procedural irregularities and pointed to my suspension as evidence of my own breach. The board panicked quietly. A regulator inquiry implied potential fines. Clients started asking for meetings. The company's general counsel, who had previously been content to let Daniel operate, stopped taking his calls. The regulator opened a preliminary inquiry. Halcyon's internal compliance team, which the board had assumed would quietly clear the department, now had to tread carefully with documents notarized and an outside journalist watching. Daniel's world began to wobble. And then came the twist. On the day the board convened for an emergency meeting, Daniel, in an attempt to save face, decided to go scorched earth. He released a dossier, An internal HR memo he claimed showed I'd had disciplinary history elsewhere. He claimed confidential client communications were missing from my archives and hinted that I'd been partying, the classics. The press smelled blood, rumors proliferated, but my lawyer had anticipated this. We'd already preserved similar memos and had legal access to the company's archived emails. We also had a former auditor from Halcyon who, fearing for his career, had agreed to testify that he'd been forced to sign off on some of Daniel's adjusted reports. The auditor's affidavit undercut Daniel's dossier point by point. The board, confronted with authenticated documents on both sides, had to let an independent external auditor in. Within 2 weeks, the board announced an independent audit. Daniel was placed on leave pending review, and the regulator requested specific transaction histories. The phantom vendor accounts were flagged, and the bank records, now subpoenaed, traced flows to accounts Daniel had used for personal transactions. The company could not bury that. The final irony was delicious in its smallness. Daniel's nephew, the one who'd been promoted to my position, resigned the day before the audit report was released. He walked out with a half-day's grace and a posture that suggested scandal was too hot for him to touch. The firm issued a terse statement. "We regret that certain accounting practices were not up to our standards," and fired Daniel quietly, a severance package and a non-disparagement clause. He walked out with the same expensive suit and a new apartment lease. Vindication arrived legally in a stack of documents, and more importantly in reputation. HR rescinded my suspension with a profuse apology. The company offered me my job back, and clients who'd wavered returned, impressed by the transparency. I published an op-ed about corporate accountability with the journalist, careful not to name the firm. Settlement lawyers are attentive beasts. The regulator fined Halcyon for procedural failures and required an overhaul of compliance. In the court of public opinion, my name was righted. But satisfaction is a complicated thing. Daniel's severance and silent exit meant his lawyers negotiated him free of criminal charges. The bank that had processed the phantom transfers was inefficient in its KYC, and that made prosecution messy. He was financially embarrassed and professionally exiled, but not in prison. He started a consulting firm 2 years later. It never got off the ground. That felt like a half-victory. He'd go on to try to sell his expertise, but no one in the right room invited him in. There were costs. My relationship with a few colleagues soured permanently. People who'd remained silent during the scandal now avoided me, afraid of how the ground might shake next. I spent months onboarding the new compliance framework, and sleep was erratic. I dreamed for years about this clean, cinematic revenge. The villain undone, justice served on a neat platter. Real life, as always, was messier. Daniel's downfall left a smell of compromise and regret that didn't dissipate entirely. The final irony was my own career trajectory. Halcyon offered me a promotion in the wake of the scandal, along with a raise and a title that came with new responsibilities I'd never wanted. I took a luxurious 2-week break instead and then declined. I had tired of being the firm's internal fault line and wary of how quickly power had shifted. A little revenge had shown me more about what I wanted, a career where trust mattered more than leverage. 6 months later, I took a job at a boutique fund where governance wasn't performative but baked into the culture. My inbox was smaller, my team kinder, and my calendar less full of politics. A year later, at a quiet bar with an old client-turned-friend, I watched as Daniel's face appeared on a muted television in the corner, a low-profile interview about ethics in business, where an unusually composed man spoke platitudes about second chances. He smiled the old smile. For a moment, heat rose in my chest. I felt the familiar itch for a final, theatrical closure. Then I sipped my drink and left it alone. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always end with the villain in handcuffs. Sometimes it ends with truth standing where lies stood, with the power to work again without fear. Sometimes it ends in the subtle, satisfying rearrangement of consequences. A profit line corrected, a client restored, a man's empire quietly crumbling into a consulting obituary. Justice may be imperfect, but it can be precise, a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer, and that precision mattered more than spectacle. If there's a moral in this, keep your receipts, cultivate allies, and remember that patience is a stealth weapon. And when someone tells you nobody will believe you, keep in mind that records, time, and a little legal ingenuity have a habit of speaking louder than a well-practiced smile. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want to hear more interesting stories from Reddit.